All right, welcome to our panel, which brings forth the policy perspectives. We have an incredibly distinguished panel, and we have all discussed how we're not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. The bios of three of our panelists are in your program. We actually have an embarrassment of riches here, so I want to at least introduce the panelists. I'll say a few words extra about those who are not in your program and we're delighted to have with us. So to my immediate left is Professor Marianne Glendon, who was the former U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. We have two existing ambassadors, a third ambassador emeritus. She's also the president emeritus of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences. So Marianne brings to her resume not only as a professor of law, but broad experience in working internationally with the Vatican. Next down the row is Rabbi David Saperstein, who's a legendary figure in the world of Washington, D.C. politics. He's worked for 40 years as the head of the Reform Jewish lobby in Washington, D.C. advocacy group. And he is now the current ambassador for international religious freedom for the United States. So we have the United States ambassador for international religious freedom with us. We're delighted to have David, and in fact, he was instrumental in the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, so he has a long resume in this field. And we're really delighted to have Ambassador Andrew Bennett, who is the first ambassador for the Canadian government. And he's a career civil servant and has headed a variety of ministries in Canada. And he's actually got a doctorate in history from Edinburgh, but he's also working on completing a degree in theology and is a subdeacon and cantor at the St. John the Baptist Ukrainian Catholic Shrine in Ottawa. So he brings both a diplomatic, an academic, and religious perspective. So we're delighted to have Ambassador Bennett with us. And then to my right, we have Heiner Bielefeld, who is the UN Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief. Very distinguished background as an academic and activist. And the thing that I learned that was fascinating is his work as the UN Rapporteur for Freedom of Religion and Belief is done pro bono. No staff, no pay. He does all of his regular academic work and then travels the world in his spare time. And that incredible enterprise. And then finally, we're delighted to have Pasquale Ferrara, who's a career diplomat and is now the Secretary General of the European University Institute in Florence. He has a distinguished career as a diplomat. He served in Santiago, Chile, Brussels, the permanent mission to the UN, or to the European Union, and to Washington, D.C. So we have his perspective with the European Union. And so we have an incredible panel here. My name is Alan Hertzke. I'm a political science professor at the University of Oklahoma. And so what we're going to do is we're going to really make this a conversation, and we are going to have some time for your questions of this distinguished group of policy advocates, ambassadors, leaders in their fields. So let me just open this discussion, and I'll let you all decide. Perhaps we'll start with you, Marianne, and let the others chime in. But I wanted to pose this question to the panel. What are the barriers or obstacles to your work in promoting international religious freedom?
Let me start by saying that one of the most painful things for me to hear over the past few days at this wonderful conference, and I expect the same is true of my colleagues, is the reference to the silence about severe persecution of Christians on the part of people in countries that are in a position to do something about it. And indeed, one of the speakers even said that silence was so deafening as to amount to complicity. I think we all felt a twinge when we heard that kind of statement. And of course, one asks oneself, what is the reason? And it seems to me that one of the greatest obstacles that many of us here face as advocates is the difficulty of convincing political decision makers and, in fact, the public at large of the importance of religious freedom as a fundamental right and of the need to defend it. And as a citizen of the United States, I ask myself, what is the reason for that? And it occurred to me over the past few days, listening to people talk about coping strategies in countries where persecution is severe, that in my own country, what were very effective coping strategies for our parents and grandparents as immigrants and members of a minority religion, those coping strategies that were effective at one time have turned into a way of life, which actually at the present time is not conducive to a robust defense of religious freedom. I'll give you the little names I have for these strategies are the strategy of the turtle and the strategy of the chameleon. So the strategy of the turtle is you keep it all inside your shell. You go out in the world and you do whatever you want to do, but one of my Harvard colleagues once said to me, I'm a Catholic, but that has nothing to do with my work. So that's the turtle strategy. The chameleon strategy is, the chameleon is the little lizard that changes its color depending on its environment. So that was a pretty good assimilationist strategy that worked pretty well for our ancestors. But now that the sons and daughters and grandchildren of those immigrants have achieved the positions in society that their parents sacrificed for, chameleon and turtle isn't the way to go. So our challenge, I think, as advocates, is really a challenge to work on our own societies to build support for religious freedom, because if you don't have a good example at home, you are not going to be very effective in defending religious freedom around the world. I'll stop there.
Fabulous. Why don't we just we'll let everyone speak, but you can choose how you go. I don't care. Heiner, why don't you go? Heiner.
Okay. Yes, I can, in my own words, also echo what Marianne just said. I think first we have to overcome a state of denial. And partially, I think we have gone that way already to a degree. Freedom of religion or belief is higher on the agenda, also internationally, than a few years ago. I would say that. At the same time, also when listening here to the various panels we had, with a lot of information, I was once again reminded, not that I needed to be reminded, that we have various patterns of violations, and many of these patterns are not known at all. So, for instance, what we heard in the second last panel on Central Asia, to pick that as a random example, these bureaucratic restrictions. The very idea that people have to register in order to be able to exercise their freedom of religion or belief. When visiting Kazakhstan, the one bureaucrat there, pretty high in the hierarchy, he said, people need a driver's license to be able to drive. And following that logic, they need a praying license in order to pray. They need a license to do missionary work. And by the way, a driver's license, once you got it, by the way, I don't have one, but most of you will have one. Once you have it for the rest of your life. But here the licenses, they must be renewed on an annual basis, at least some of them. They are confined to a certain territory, and you never know exactly where the boundaries are. So thereby creating gray zones deliberately of legal insecurity. This is just one random example of what happens totally, or almost totally, under the radar. Of course, we have now paid more attention to what's happening with ISIS, for instance. Okay, there is an increasing awareness, which I very much welcome. But nonetheless, there are so many violations taking place on a daily basis without finding any public attention. And that has also to do with, and here again I would echo Marianne, with maybe misperceptions. that freedom of religion or belief, also in the human rights agenda, should not be the most important one. It's a neglected human right. Some people would even question, is it a human right at all? Because for some, human right sounds like human, it must be something, a humanist agenda. And here, out of a sudden, religion comes into play. Does it even fit? Okay, I mean, that is a strange idea, but you wouldn't believe how often I really come across that understanding. But I would not only say, of course it's a human right, I would go a step further and say, it's an indispensable human right. Everyone agrees, without freedom of expression, the whole system of human rights collapses. Without freedom of association or habeas corpus, I mean, it's not even conceivable to have human rights. But with freedom of religion or belief, people think, okay, this is more a privilege for those people who still find religion interesting. It's privileging the homo religiosos. It's a clientelistic right. I mean, those are the misunderstandings. Of course, it's all rubbish. It's all stupid stuff. But again, I mean, let me just say, it's very, very frequently that I come across these misunderstandings in the midst of the human rights community, in the midst of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, so in the midst of the UN also. So there's a lot of work to do to tell people it is as indispensable as any human right can possibly be. Without that, we are not just left with a gap. Without freedom of religion or belief, the whole system of human rights would cease to make sense. Without paying respect to that existential dimension of human life, deep convictions, identity-shaping convictions that human people have, that human people wish to be respected, to see respected, the whole system of human rights would cease to be relevant. And that is really something, that's a message we have to get across.
Powerful statement. And I saw you shaking your head, Ambassador Bennett, so what about you? As the newest ambassador for international religious freedom from Canada.
Well, thanks very much, Alan. Well, I sort of agree broadly with what my two colleagues have said, but I want to just maybe give a little bit of nuance to one point, and this is what Heiner was mentioning, the sheer complexity of the issue. Yeah. For example, in our office in Ottawa, we probably engage actively on religious freedom issues in between 17 and 20 countries. That ranges, and Ambassador Saperstein will be aware of this as well, it ranges from the type of restrictions on religious practice that we see in Central Asia. It's the egregious violations and persecutions in Iraq and Syria under ISIS. And it's a whole range of things. It's the instrumentalization of religion in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So for policymakers, being able to get your mind around the sheer complexity of what you have to address when it comes to religious freedom in the context of a certain, I would say, poverty that many of us have about even discussing religion in terms of public policy. And that's something that I think is very important. And one thing I've found in our work in Ottawa, we've actively engaged our colleagues in terms of training, in terms of educating foreign service professionals on how you address matters of religion, including religious freedom, when you engage overseas. And many of my colleagues, when they're posted abroad, they realize that they need to engage on matters of religion, because religion informs not only a perceived cultural discourse, but social, political, economic discourses in many, many countries. And we have a real responsibility, as other speakers have said over the last couple of days, to educate and to really inform policymakers who are not maybe as familiar with this world, the world of religion and how religion intersects with international relations. The duty we have in our roles to inform them and to aid our colleagues so they can engage on this issue, because of just the sort of formation that we've had in the West for a very long time. We've not been socialized or educated to speak about religion publicly. And so this is a challenge. I think it's a challenge that is recognized broadly by people, especially when you begin to talk about it. People will say, yes, I mean, I get it. I've been posted overseas. I see that when I'm in Pakistan that religion is something that I need to get. And I need to have the language through which I can speak about it, so as to engage actively, so as to be an effective diplomat. And I think that I've certainly seen over the last 3 years since I've been in this position, there is that growing recognition, which is positive. Majid Nawaz of the Quilliam Foundation talks about the Voldemort effect when talking about a recognition of what Islamism and jihadism are. And for those of you that have read the Harry Potter novels, in the very early novels, no one wants to speak about Voldemort because Voldemort is this horrible, evil presence. And so if we don't talk about him, then we don't have to deal with him, and we don't have to address him. So we need to, I think, recognize that often in the West, when we're trying to address these challenges, to not let ourselves slip into that type of mentality where if we don't talk about religion, then we won't have to address the messiness about it. I think we really do need to have a very winsome and nuanced understanding of how we can engage so as to advocate on behalf of international religious freedom and how that connects with other broader human rights, as Heiner so eloquently phrased it.
Well, thank you for introducing me to a new vocabulary, the Voldemort effect, which I know my younger son would understand. Pasquale, from your perspective, both on the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and now with the European University Institute, tell us about your thoughts on this question.
Yep. I would like just to elaborate on this concept of religious engagement for diplomats, which is a new challenge for diplomacy worldwide. Because the way it has been phrased in religious freedom in many Western European ministers of foreign affairs has been mostly for many years in terms of protecting Christian minorities. And this issue of protection implies the presence of a state power intervening in the internal affairs of another country. So it's quite delicate from this point of view. So shifting from this idea of protecting to the idea of engaging in a listening mode to the same communities and also to other religious communities that needs to be protected. I was just reading a report on how many Shia mosques has been bombed in the last few years. So there is a need of creating more consistency in the approach on religious freedom in order to be more credible and also more effective in protecting the while they are discriminated and persecuted. And also, I would like to say that looking at the European experience, we need to be also more coherent. For instance, now the issue of religious differences in Europe is becoming an important topic in the political agenda. Prosecution of the Jew community, but also Islamophobia, that are becoming more and more at the center of the political message. So this is something that creates some imbalance that needs to be overcome. In my own country, religious freedom is protected by the Constitution, enshrined in the Constitution, but at the same time, from the time in which the Constitution was approved in 1948, the world has changed dramatically. So, for instance, in our case, I think that we would need to have a comprehensive law on religious freedom attached to the constitutional guarantees. I say that because you need to put your home in order before going abroad, engaging in religious conversation. There is a region in Italy and other local authorities that actually make very difficult to build a mosque or to create a place where peacefully and in a very open, transparent way, Muslim community can pray. So I think that this issue of being coherent and consistent is absolutely crucial in order to be also more effective in protecting religious freedom for Christians worldwide.
That's very valuable, the notion that you have to get your own house in order, we've already heard. So, Rabbi David Saperstein, Ambassador Saperstein, you got many titles, so tell us what...
So let me just add to these with a quick list of obstacles that exist here. First, as been alluded to, the bureaucratic mentality of totalitarian regimes fearful of people organizing their lives to an authority other than the state in a way the state can't control. And the response of the state is through registration, all these approval things. It's not just annual registration. It's, in many of these regimes, having to get every single action they do approved. Who can go to seminary? Who can they hire as a pastor? When they can celebrate publicly their events, what they can say in the pulpit. Pervasive control of it. Secondly, the ignorance of the problem. There are hundreds of millions of good, caring people who had no idea about any of the things you talked about so eloquently at this conference. They just don't know it exists. And trying to pierce that, and we all do it, every person in this room tries to contribute to changing that, but it is a daunting obstacle to our common agenda. Third, what it's taught children in our schools. The lack of teaching about the cultural diversity of the societies and countries in which they are growing up and communities, the lack of teaching about what religion is and what different religions are, leaves those religions and religion in general, depending on the country we're talking about, as the other, something they don't understand, they hear rumors about, they hear misdescriptions about, etc., and it becomes fearful. Fourth, the fear of terrorism. Fighting terrorism is used over and over again as a justification to repress religious expression. Fifth, the inherent imbalance between the minority of religious extremists who constitute a minority, who are willing to use machetes, guns, and force to impose their religious views on those who differ, and the vast majority of people who eschew the use of force and abide by the rule of law. There is not parity between those groups. People willing to use violence often dominate the dynamics of a society in a way that the religious communities of which you have been talking about here are always at a disadvantage. Six, the crackdown in general, of the NGO world and civil society that we're seeing. This isn't just about religion. Too many countries are describing human rights as Western cultural imperialism being imposed on other nations, particularly in the form of religion, and that they have a right to define rights in their own cultural terms that work for their people and their nation, even if they're signatories to international human rights agreement. And we are seeing across the globe crackdowns on the NGO world and civil society in very alarming ways. And without a robust civil society, without the ability to people to organize in the NGO world, to fight for a better society, you cannot win the fight for religious freedom alone. It is all part and parcel of the same battle. So as I think about the obstacles that we face regularly, those would be the list I come up with.
Yeah, I'd like to add a seventh item to David's list, and it would be under the heading of bureaucratic mentality, but it would be bureaucratic mentality in the countries that at least are formally committed to the defense of religious freedom. I know that Andrew Bennett has already spoken about the blind spot that exists in the culture of some of our official apparatus. And Heiner and I once were present at a dinner given by an American ambassador where that was well illustrated. The ambassador gave a dinner for a whole group of religious freedom advocates who were visiting his city, and we sat at the table, and he said, now, religious freedom, I don't know anything about that, but you guys go ahead and talk about whatever you want to talk about. Now, it seems to me, having been an American ambassador, to invite a group of religious freedom advocates to your table and not begin by expressing the commitment of your own government and your understanding of that issue is pretty shocking. And I could give you 5 or 6 more examples, but I won't. So, Andrew, you go ahead.
Well, I want to just elaborate on both Marianne's points and David's points, and that is about the responsibility that we bear I mean, all of us as human beings, as persons, bear a responsibility towards those who are being persecuted, to those who are having their human dignity violated. But I think because of the heritage of our own countries, whether it's the United States, whether it's Italy, whether it's Germany, Canada, you know, especially in the case of the US and Canada, our countries are multicultural, multi-faith, and pluralist. And not just pluralist in a kind of a general sense, they're inclusively pluralist. And so we really have a responsibility, not only as advocates of a broad understanding of human rights and how all those human rights fit together, and that religious freedom is a distinct human right, that buttresses freedom of association, freedom of expression, equality between men and women, a whole range of other rights. But you know, as Canada, I think, I'll speak for Canada, you know, we have a real responsibility, I think, to take the Canadian experience of an inclusive, pluralist, multicultural, multi-faith society that has had to work out challenges in the area of religious freedom through our history. And like Italy and like the United States, we have protection for freedom of religion and conscience in our Charter of Rights. But we have a responsibility, I think, in our foreign policy to work with countries that are also multicultural and multi-faith, like Burma, like Pakistan, like Russia, India, China, to share that Canadian experience. And to talk also about, you know, where in the past we've made mistakes, where we've, you know, persecuted particular communities. Jehovah's Witnesses in Quebec back in the 1950s. You know, my alma mater, McGill University, didn't allow Jewish students until the middle of the 20th century, roughly speaking. So, you know, we have our own history, but it's through rule of law, through robust institutions, and a respect for human rights that we have addressed that, and through the wonderful process of bringing new communities into the country, where we've learned how to accommodate and to engage in an inclusive pluralism. And that's what we're seeing now with the Syrian refugees that are now coming to Canada. So we have, I think we bear that responsibility.